It was a night that would forever haunt 27-year-old Emma Carter. The kind of night where the sky seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the promise of a storm. Emma had always loved thunderstorms, the way the lightning lit up the sky, the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. But this storm would be different. This storm would change everything. Emma lived alone in a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods of Vermont. The cabin had been her grandfather's, a place she'd inherited after his passing. It was peaceful, quiet, and far from the noise of the city, exactly what she needed after a long week of work. That Friday evening, as the first drops of rain began to fall, Emma settled in with a book and a cup of tea, content to ride out the storm in cozy solitude. But as the storm grew stronger, so did the unease that crept into Emma's chest. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the roof. The thunder was deafening, each clap shaking the cabin to its foundations. And then the power went out. Emma sighed, setting her book aside and fumbling for the flashlight she kept in the drawer. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. She lit a few candles, their flickering glow providing a small comfort against the oppressive blackness outside. It was then that she heard it, a knock at the door. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who could possibly be out in this weather? She hesitated, then called out, "Who's there?" No answer, just the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. Emma told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her. But then the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She grabbed the flashlight and approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. "Hello?" she called again, her voice barely audible over the storm. Still no answer. Emma peered through the peephole, but all she could see was darkness. She unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, the wind immediately whipping it open wider. The beam of her flashlight swept across the porch, illuminating nothing but rain and shadows. "Is anyone there?" she shouted, her voice swallowed by the storm. "No one!" Emma closed the door and locked it, her heart still racing. She told herself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the door, but deep down she knew better. The storm raged on, and Emma tried to distract herself by reading by candlelight, but the knock came again, this time at the window. She spun around, her flashlight beam darting to the source of the sound. For a split second she thought she saw a face, pale, gaunt and streaked with rain, pressed against the glass. Emma screamed and dropped the flashlight, the room plunging into darkness. She scrambled to relight the candles, her hands shaking so badly she could barely strike the match. When the light returned, the face was gone. But the knocking didn't stop. It moved from window to window, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo in Emma's skull. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. Just like the power, the storm had taken that too. She was completely alone. Desperate, Emma grabbed a kitchen knife and stood in the center of the room, her eyes darting to every window, every shadow. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the entire cabin was vibrating with the force of it, and then silence. The storm seemed to pause, the rain slowing to a drizzle, the wind dying down to a whisper. Emma held her breath, her grip tightening on the knife. The silence was worse than the knocking, worse than the storm. It was the silence of something waiting, watching. And then a voice. "Let me in." It was low, guttural, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emma's blood turned to ice. She backed away from the windows, her eyes wide with terror. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice didn't answer. Instead it repeated, "Let me in." Emma's mind raced. She couldn't stay here, but she couldn't go outside either. The storm had turned the woods into a labyrinth of darkness and danger. She was trapped. The knocking started again, this time on the roof. It was louder now, more forceful, as if whatever was out there was growing impatient. Emma crouched in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around her knees, the knife clutched tightly in her hand. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, Emma couldn't tell. The storm returned with a vengeance, the rain pounding against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. The knocking continued, relentless, maddening. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The storm began to fade, the rain slowing to a gentle patter, the wind dying down to a whisper. Emma stayed in the corner, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Emma finally dared to move. She crept to the window and peered outside. The porch was empty, the yard littered with branches and leaves. There was no sign of anyone or anything having been there. But as Emma stepped outside, her heart stopped. There, in the mud, were footprints leading up to the door and then back into the woods. Emma never spent another night in the cabin. She sold it a week later, refusing to step foot inside ever again. But to this day, she swears she can still hear the knocking, still feel the presence of something watching her from the shadows. And whenever a storm rolls in, she makes sure she's never alone. It was a storm unlike any other. The kind of storm that made the sky look like it was alive, pulsing with veins of lightning that lit up the night in blinding flashes. For 34-year-old Daniel Hayes, it was just another night on the road. A long-haul trucker by trade, Daniel had seen his fair share of bad weather, but this storm was different. This storm had a mind of its own. Daniel was driving through the back roads of Oklahoma, the kind of roads that seemed to stretch on forever, surrounded by nothing but fields and the occasional abandoned barn. The rain was coming down in sheets, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The radio crackled with static, the only station he could find cutting in and out with warnings of severe weather, but Daniel wasn't worried. He'd driven through worse, or so he thought. It started with the lightning. At first it was just the usual flashes in the distance, illuminating the horizon in brief bursts of light. But then the strikes grew closer, brighter, more frequent. It was as if the storm was following him, chasing him down the empty road. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white. The thunder was deafening, each clap shaking the truck and rattling his nerves. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by a flash of lightning. Daniel slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. The truck came to a stop just feet away from the figure, who stood perfectly still, their face obscured by the darkness. "What the hell?" Daniel muttered, his heart pounding. He honked the horn, but the figure didn't move. Against his better judgment, Daniel grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. The rain soaked him instantly, the wind whipping at his clothes. He shone the light on the figure and his blood ran cold. It was a man, but he wasn't human. His skin was pale and cracked, like porcelain, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. His hair stood on end as if charged with electricity, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," the man said, his voice crackling like static. Daniel stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his hand. The man took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Who? What are you?" Daniel stammered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, and a bolt of lightning shot down from the sky, striking the ground just feet away from Daniel. The force of the blast knocked him off his feet, his ears ringing as he hit the wet pavement. When he looked up, the man was gone. Daniel scrambled back into the truck, his hands trembling as he started the engine. He drove faster, desperate to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. But the storm followed him, the lightning growing brighter, more intense, and then he saw it again, the man standing in the middle of the road, his glowing eyes fixed on Daniel. Daniel swerved, the truck skidding off the road and into a ditch. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment everything went black. When he came to, the storm had stopped, the rain was gone, the wind silent, but the man was still there, standing outside the truck, his face pressed against the window. Daniel screamed and fumbled for the door handle, but it was stuck. The man's smile widened, his glowing eyes boring into Daniel's soul. "You can't escape," the man said, his voice echoing in Daniel's mind. And then the lightning returned. It struck the truck with a force that sent Daniel flying, the world around him dissolving into blinding light and deafening noise. When he opened his eyes, he was back on the road, driving through the storm as if nothing had happened. But something was different. The lightning was brighter, closer, more frequent, and every time it struck, Daniel saw the man's face, his glowing eyes, his grotesque smile. Daniel drove for hours, the storm never letting up, the man always just out of sight. He tried to call for help, but his phone was dead. He tried to stop, but the truck wouldn't slow down. It was as if he was trapped in a nightmare, a loop of endless road and relentless storm. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the storm stopped. The rain ceased, the wind died down, and the lightning faded into the distance. Daniel pulled over, his hands trembling as he stepped out of the truck. The road was empty, the sky clear, but as he looked down, his heart stopped. There in the mud were footprints leading away from the truck, and then back into the woods. Daniel never drove that route again. But to this day, whenever a storm rolls in, he swears he can still see the man's face, his glowing eyes, his grotesque smile, and he knows the storm is never far behind. The storm had been raging for hours, the kind of storm that seemed to swallow the world in darkness. Heavy raindrops pounded against the windshield of Rebecca's old sedan, each one a tiny hammer against the glass. The wipers worked furiously, but the rain was relentless, blurring the road ahead into a smear of grey and black. Rebecca's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her eyes straining to find the lines on the road. She had been on her way to a weekend retreat with friends, a chance to escape the stress of work and city life, but her GPS had lost signal hours ago, and every turn seemed to lead her deeper into the winding back roads. The trees on either side of the road were tall and ancient, their twisted branches reaching over the road like fingers. When the car sputtered and died, Rebecca's stomach dropped. She coasted to a stop, the headlights cutting through the sheets of rain to reveal nothing but empty road and forest. She turned the key, but the engine only whined. Her phone was no help. The battery was dead. She sat for a moment, the sound of the storm swallowing her in a cocoon of noise. She had no choice. She needed to find help, and sitting in the car wasn't going to save her. She pulled her jacket tight around her and stepped out into the storm, the cold rain soaking her within seconds. The only light was a dim yellow glow in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was her only option. She set off down the road, her shoes squelching in the mud, the rain biting into her skin. The trees whispered around her, their branches scraping against each other in the wind. As she drew closer, the light became clearer. An old house standing alone at the end of a long gravel driveway. It was 2 stories, its windows dark, the paint peeling from the wooden siding. The light came from a lantern hanging on the porch, swaying gently despite the lack of wind. Rebecca hesitated at the gate, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the cold had sunk into her bones, and the thought of standing in the storm any longer was unbearable. She pushed the gate open, the metal hinges groaning, and made her way to the front door. She knocked, the sound hollow against the wood. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time, her hand aching from the impact. Still nothing. She tried the door, and to her surprise it swung open with a soft creak. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and rot. She stepped inside, her wet shoes sinking into the threadbare carpet. "Hello?" Her voice was small in the vastness of the house. "Is anyone here?" Her words echoed back to her, the silence settling around her like a shroud. She moved deeper into the house, her feet dragging as if the air itself were trying to hold her back. The hallway stretched on, lined with old photographs whose faces were blurred with age. The eyes of the figures seemed to follow her, their expressions twisted and strange. The house was old, but everything seemed off. The furniture was arranged neatly, the candles on the mantel fresh and unburned. But there was a layer of dust over everything, as if the house had been abandoned for years. She found the living room, a cold fireplace dominating one wall, and sat on the edge of a tattered armchair. Her body ached, exhaustion wrapping around her like a blanket. She must have drifted off, because when she opened her eyes, the room was different. The candles were lit, their flames casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The rain outside had stopped, and the house was filled with the soft hum of voices. Rebecca stood, her mind struggling to catch up. She moved to the doorway, peering into the hallway. Figures moved through the shadows, people dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and expressionless. She called out to them, but they didn't respond. She stepped into the hallway, and they moved around her, their eyes fixed on something beyond her. She followed them, her feet moving on their own, the house shifting around her. They led her to a room at the end of the hall, the door half open. She pushed it wider, and the room inside was filled with people. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, their backs to her, all facing the bed at the center of the room. Rebecca moved through the crowd, her breath hitching in her throat. When she reached the front, her knees buckled. On the bed lay a woman, her skin pale, her hair wet and matted against her forehead. She wore Rebecca's jacket, her shoes caked with mud, her eyes wide and staring at the ceiling. Rebecca reached out, her hand trembling, and the woman on the bed blinked. The crowd around her began to hum, a low, mournful sound that filled the room. The woman's lips moved, and Rebecca heard the words as if they were whispered directly into her ear. "You shouldn't have come here." The room darkened, the shadows stretching and swallowing the light. The figures turned, their faces no longer human, eyes hollow, mouths stretched into impossible, unnatural grins. Rebecca screamed, but the sound died in her throat. The walls closed in, the floor slipping away beneath her feet. She fell, the world twisting around her, the faces of the figures stretching and warping as they reached for her. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her car. The storm was still raging, the windshield wipers scraping uselessly against the glass. She sat up, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding against her ribs. But the house was still there, just beyond the trees, its windows glowing with candlelight. And in the rear-view mirror she saw them. Pale figures standing in the rain, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their lips moving in unison. "You shouldn't have come here!" The car engine sputtered to life on its own, the wheels turning, dragging her back toward the house, the headlights illuminating the long, dark driveway that seemed to stretch on forever. And no matter how hard she screamed, no matter how much she fought, Rebecca knew she would never leave Willow Hill. And there you have it. 3 bone-chilling tales of storms that brought more than just rain and thunder. From phantom visitors to relentless knocking, these stories remind us that sometimes the scariest things come with the weather. If these tales kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a story, because the next storm might just bring something you'll never forget. Until next time, stay safe, stay dry, and remember, when the thunder rolls, you might not want to answer the door.